They gave me a plastic chair. Not even one of the nice ones with the cushion and the white slipcover tied in a bow. Just a folding chair, the kind you'd find stacked in a church basement, wedged between the caterer's supply cart and a rack of extra coat hangers in a hallway behind the banquet room. That was my seat at my sister's rehearsal dinner. And somehow that wasn't even the part that broke me. The part that broke me came later, when a retired federal judge, a woman who had once sworn me in as a newly licensed attorney, walked into that hallway looking for the restroom, spotted me sitting there alone with a plate of lukewarm pasta balanced on my knees, and stopped dead in her tracks. She looked at the chair. She looked at the hallway. She looked at me. Then she said, very quietly, "Get up. You're sitting with me tonight." When she stood to speak 20 minutes later, the entire room turned to face us, and my mother's smile disappeared. But I need to go back. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 31 years old, and I'm an attorney specializing in housing rights for veterans. I've argued cases before appellate courts, helped families keep their homes, and once spent 11 straight hours in a mediation that saved a disabled Marine's property from an illegal foreclosure. I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because the people in that banquet room, my own family, had no idea. Or maybe they did, and it simply didn't matter. My sister, Caroline, was the center of everything. She always had been. 2 years older, blonde where I was dark, soft-spoken where I was blunt, effortlessly graceful in ways I never learned to be. She married well the first time, a dentist from Scottsdale, and when that ended, she married even better. Tyler Ashford, heir to a mid-size hotel chain in the Southeast, the kind of man whose last name opened doors before he even knocked. Their wedding was the event of the season in our parents' circle. A 3-day affair at a sprawling lakeside estate outside Savannah, Georgia, complete with a string quartet, imported orchids, and a guest list that read like a country club directory. I was not a bridesmaid. I want to be clear about that. My sister had 6 bridesmaids, her college roommate, 2 sorority sisters, Tyler's cousin, her Pilates instructor, and a woman she'd met at a wine tasting event in Napa 3 months earlier, not her only sister. When I asked, casually, over the phone in March, she laughed lightly and said, "Rach, I already have 6. 7 is weird, you understand." I said I understood. I didn't. My parents lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Charlotte, the kind of subdivision with stone entrance signs and HOA rules about mailbox colors. My father, Donald Whitfield, sold commercial insurance for 35 years and retired early with enough money to spend his days golfing and telling everyone about Caroline's life. My mother, Jeanette, ran the women's auxiliary at their church, organized charity luncheons, and had an uncanny talent for making my accomplishments sound like minor hobbies. "Rachel does something with law," she'd say when neighbors asked. "Legal aid, I think. She helps people with paperwork." I didn't help people with paperwork. I litigated. I fought. I stood in courtrooms and argued against banks and predatory lenders on behalf of people who had served this country and been tossed aside. But in my mother's narration of our family, Caroline was the chapter and I was the footnote. Growing up, the dynamic was never subtle. Caroline won pageants. I won debate tournaments. Caroline got a car for her 16th birthday. I got told that maybe next year finances were tight even though they weren't. At Thanksgiving, the conversation always orbited Caroline, her promotions, her vacations, her decorating projects, the clever things she'd said at someone's dinner party. When I passed the bar exam on my first try, my father said, "Good. Now you can stop worrying us." When Caroline got engaged to Tyler, he cried actual tears at the dinner table. I don't think my parents were cruel people. I think they were ordinary people with an extraordinary blind spot. Caroline fit their vision of success. Beautiful, married, socially fluent, living a life that photographed well. I didn't fit. I was too intense, too independent, too focused on work that didn't translate into small talk at cocktail parties. And instead of adjusting their lens, they simply stopped looking. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening, hosted at the estate's private dining room. A gorgeous space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. I drove down from Charlotte that morning, 5 hours through small-town Georgia, arriving with just enough time to check into my hotel, iron my dress, and remind myself to smile. When I walked into the venue, the dining room was already glowing. Candles everywhere, soft music, laughter drifting through an arched doorway. I scanned for my name on the seating chart displayed on an easel near the entrance. The chart was beautifully designed, hand-lettered in gold calligraphy on cream paper, with little illustrated oak leaves framing each table. Table 1. Parents. Tyler's parents. The minister. Table 2. Bridal party. Table 3. Tyler's business partners. Table 4. Family friends and college roommates. I found my name on a separate card taped, not pinned, taped, to the bottom corner of the display, with an arrow pointing toward the hallway. Overflow seating. Hallway B. I stared at it. Overflow. As if I were a surplus guest at a conference, not the bride's only sister. I walked down the hallway and found my seat, a single folding chair beside a small round table wedged between the catering staging area and a coat rack. There was a plate already set, salad, bread roll, a glass of water, no wine, no place card, just a chair. I sat down. I smoothed my dress over my knees. I listened to the muffled sound of toasts happening on the other side of the wall, and I did what I had spent a lifetime learning to do. I made myself small. I should tell you how I ended up becoming a lawyer, because it matters. I was 22, fresh out of college with a political science degree and no clear plan, when I volunteered at a legal aid clinic near Fort Bragg. The clinic helped military families, mostly spouses and veterans, navigate landlord disputes, benefits paperwork, wrongful evictions. The work was unglamorous and overwhelming, and I fell in love with it instantly. I saw a staff sergeant's wife lose her housing because a landlord exploited a clause she didn't understand. I watched a Purple Heart recipient get denied disability benefits over a filing error. I sat across from a veteran who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan and couldn't afford a lawyer to fight a predatory loan that was swallowing his home. These people had given everything, and the system was chewing them up. I enrolled in law school that fall, paid my own way through scholarships and bartending shifts, graduated near the top of my class, took a job at a nonprofit legal organization instead of a firm, which meant less money, longer hours, and zero prestige at family dinners. My father once said to a neighbor within earshot, "Caroline married into the Ashford family. Rachel works for a charity." He said, charity, the way you might say, hobby. But in the courtrooms where I worked, I mattered. Judges knew my name. Veterans sent me letters. One client, a 70-year-old Korean War veteran named Mr. Fenton, called me every Christmas to say thank you for saving his house. "You fought for me when nobody else would," he'd say. "Don't ever let anyone tell you that doesn't count." I carried those words like armor. I needed them, especially on nights like the rehearsal dinner, sitting alone in a hallway with a bread roll and the sound of my sister's laughter leaking through the walls. I was halfway through my salad when the hallway door opened. I expected a server, maybe someone looking for the restroom. Instead, I saw a tall woman in her early 60s, silver hair cut short, wearing a navy blazer and an expression of quiet authority that I recognized immediately. Judge Catherine Hargrove. Retired now, but once one of the most respected federal judges in the Fourth Circuit, she had presided over housing discrimination cases that changed policy across 3 states. She had written opinions that I had studied in law school, quoted in briefs, cited in arguments, and 12 years ago she had been the judge who administered my oath when I was admitted to the bar. She stopped when she saw me. "Rachel Whitfield?" I almost dropped my fork. "Judge Hargrove." She looked at the hallway. The folding chair. The coat rack behind me. The catering cart 3 feet away. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes hardened. "Why are you out here?" I shrugged with practiced ease. "Overflow seating. It's a big wedding party. You're the bride's sister." "I am." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled the folding chair from the other side of my little table, sat down across from me, and folded her hands the way she used to on the bench, patient, deliberate, immovable. "I know who you are, Rachel. I followed your work. The Marsden case last year. You argued that before the Fourth Circuit, didn't you?" I blinked. "You know about that." I read the opinion. Brilliant argument. You saved that family's home and established precedent that's already being cited in 3 other districts. She tilted her head slightly. "And you're eating dinner next to a coat rack." I didn't know what to say. She stood. "Come with me. Judge, I can't just—" "You can, and you will. I'm not leaving you in a hallway." There was no arguing with Judge Hargrove. I learned that in law school, and I relearned it in that hallway. She waited while I set my plate on the catering cart, then she walked me through the door and into the dining room like I belonged there. The room was warm, golden, full of conversation and candlelight. Every table was occupied. I saw my parents at the head table, my mother laughing at something Tyler's father had said. Caroline was radiant in a cream-colored dress, leaning into Tyler, looking exactly like the kind of bride magazines put on their covers. Nobody noticed me enter. Nobody ever did. Judge Hargrove walked straight to table 3, Tyler's business partners and their spouses, and addressed a man I didn't recognize. "Frank, would you mind shifting down one? I'd like my guest to sit here." It wasn't a question. Frank moved. A chair appeared. Suddenly, I was seated at table 3 with a cloth napkin, a wine glass, and the quiet, terrifying sensation of being visible. The judge sat beside me and signaled the server for 2 glasses of wine without asking what I wanted. She knew what I needed wasn't a drink. It was someone acting like I mattered. Conversations resumed around us. Tyler's business partner across the table made polite introductions. His wife asked how I knew the judge. Before I could answer, Judge Hargrove said, "Rachel is one of the finest attorneys I've had the privilege of watching develop. She's done more for veterans' housing rights in this state than most firms do in a decade." The table went quiet for a beat. Tyler's partner raised his eyebrows. "Really? That's impressive. Are you with a firm?" "I run the litigation division at a veterans legal aid organization," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "She's being modest," the judge added. "She argued before the Fourth Circuit last year and won a case that's reshaping housing discrimination law." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. Across the room, I caught my mother glancing our way, her brow furrowed in the particular way it furrowed when something was happening outside her control. Dinner continued. Toasts were made. Tyler's best man told a long, affectionate story about a fishing trip gone wrong. Caroline's maid of honor talked about sorority memories and late-night study sessions. Everyone laughed. Everyone raised their glasses. Then there was a pause. The natural lull between toasts when people refill their wine and check their phones. In that gap, Judge Hargrove set down her glass, placed her napkin on the table, and stood. The room didn't fall silent immediately. It took a few seconds. First, the people nearest to us noticed. Then, like a ripple moving outward, conversations dropped away. Heads turned. There was something about her, the posture, the calm authority, the way she occupied space without apology, that made people stop and listen. My mother's smile froze. My father lowered his whiskey. "Forgive me for interrupting," she began, and her voice carried effortlessly across the room. "I know this evening belongs to Caroline and Tyler, and I wish them nothing but happiness." A few people nodded and smiled. Caroline looked curious but uncertain. "I'm Catherine Hargrove. I spent 32 years on the federal bench, and in that time I learned that you can tell a great deal about a family by how they treat the people who don't seek the spotlight." The room was perfectly still now. Tonight, I stepped into a hallway looking for the restroom and found someone sitting alone on a folding chair beside a coat rack. She had a plate of food on her knees and no wine in her glass. She was the bride's only sister. A murmur rippled through the guests. My mother's hand drifted to her throat. Now, I've seen Rachel Whitfield stand in federal courtrooms and argue cases that changed law. I've watched her fight for veterans who had nowhere else to turn, people who served this country and came home to find their homes being taken from them. She has won cases that are cited in legal journals. She has saved families. She has made a difference in the world that very few people ever do. My eyes burned. I pressed my fingernails into my palms under the table, and tonight she was seated in a hallway. She paused, letting the silence do its work. I don't say this to embarrass anyone. I say it because sometimes families lose sight of what matters. Sometimes the person who gives the most gets seen the least. And sometimes it takes a stranger to walk into a hallway and say what the family should have said years ago. She raised her glass. To Rachel Whitfield, attorney, advocate, and someone who deserves a chair at every table, not just the ones in hallways. The room erupted. People stood. Glasses rose. Applause filled the space like something physical pressing against my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. 12 years of being the afterthought, the footnote, the daughter who does something with paperwork. And in 60 seconds, a woman I hadn't seen in over a decade had torn the curtain away. When the applause faded, Judge Hargrove sat down, took a sip of her wine, and said quietly, "They needed to hear it." I swallowed. "I don't know what to say." "Then say nothing. Just sit up straight. You've earned this seat." I sat up straight. "You've earned this seat." I sat up straight. The first person to approach me was Tyler's mother, a gracious woman with kind eyes who touched my arm and said, "I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell us about you?" I didn't have an answer that wouldn't hurt someone, so I just smiled. The second person was my father. He crossed the room slowly, hands in his pockets, jaw tight. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, but the way a man looks when something he believed for years has been quietly dismantled in public. "Rachel." "Dad." He sat down in the chair the judge had quietly vacated, giving us space. For a long moment, he just looked at the tablecloth, tracing the edge of a fold with his finger. "I didn't know about the hallway," he said. "Yes, you did. It came out sharper than I intended." He flinched. "The seating chart has been on Caroline's website for 2 weeks," I continued, quieter now. "Overflow. Hallway B. My name. Your daughter's name." He was quiet. "I'm not angry, Dad. I'm tired. I've been tired for a long time." He exhaled slowly, the way a man does when he's been holding something for years and the weight has finally cracked through. "Your mother and we didn't mean." "I know you didn't mean it. That's almost worse. It means you weren't thinking about me at all." That landed. I watched it hit. His eyes reddened at the edges, not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "I followed your work," he said, and his voice cracked on the word work. "I read the article in the Charlotte Observer last year, the one about the veteran, Mr. Marston." I stared at him. "You read that?" "I cut it out. It's in my desk drawer." "I didn't know that." "I had no idea. I didn't know how to say I was proud," he continued. "Your mother and we understand Caroline's life. We know how to talk about weddings and houses and grandchildren. We don't know how to talk about courtrooms and case law," and he waved his hand vaguely. "We don't know your world, Rachel. And instead of learning, we just stopped trying." My throat tightened. "I needed you to try." "I know." He reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was firm, almost urgent, like a man grabbing a rope he'd let slip years ago. "I want to try now, if you'll let me." I nodded slowly. My vision blurred. "I'd like that." He squeezed my hand once, then released it. "I'm going to talk to your mother. And your sister. Things are going to be different. They don't have to be dramatic, Dad. I don't need a parade. I just need a seat at the table." He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw something I hadn't seen since I was a child holding up a debate trophy in the living room. Pride. Real, unguarded, aching pride. "You've always deserved one," he said. "I'm sorry it took a stranger to remind me." He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked back toward the head table, but halfway there he turned and said, "Come to dinner Sunday. Just us. I want to hear about your cases." "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." The rest of the evening moved differently, like the air itself had shifted. Guests approached me. Tyler's business partner asked for my card. A woman from Caroline's church told me her nephew was a veteran struggling with a landlord and asked if I could help. I said yes. That's what I always said. Caroline found me near the end of the night, standing by the windows overlooking the lake. The moon had risen, casting silver across the water. She stood beside me for a while without speaking. "I didn't think about the seating," she said finally. "I honestly didn't think about it." "I know. That's what makes it bad, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said. "It is." She was quiet. Then, the judge was right. You should have been up there with me. With the bridal party, with family. I don't need to be a bridesmaid, Caroline. I just needed to not be in a hallway. She nodded. Her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry, Ratch. I know you are." We stood together looking at the water. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. We didn't hug and cry and fix 20 years of distance in 3 minutes. But she saw me. For the first time in a long time, my sister actually saw me. Judge Hargrove found me as she was leaving. She buttoned her blazer and looked out at the lake one last time. "You all right, counselor?" I let out a breath. "I think so. I think things might actually change." "They might," she agreed. "But change doesn't come from one speech. It comes from what happens Monday morning. Don't let them slide back." "I won't." She nodded. "You know, the best advocates I've known share one trait. They fight for everyone except themselves. Don't make that mistake, Rachel. You deserve the same fight you give your clients." I walked her to her car. The night air was warm and heavy with Georgia pine. Somewhere across the lake, a bullfrog was singing. "Thank you," I said, "for not walking past that hallway." She smiled, knowing, the kind of smile earned over decades. I never walk past injustice, not in courtrooms, not in hallways. She drove away. I stood in the parking lot for a while, letting the quiet settle. The wedding the next day was beautiful. Caroline glowed. Tyler beamed. The lakeside ceremony was everything a wedding should be, and this time, I sat in the third row. Not the first. I didn't need the first. But the third row with the clear view of my sister's face when she said her vows, with my parents 2 rows ahead turning back to smile at me. My father caught my eye during the ring exchange and gave me a small nod. Not the dismissive kind I'd grown up with, but a real one, the kind that said, "I see you." The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. My mother took longer to change. She still introduced me vaguely at her luncheons. "Rachel does legal work," but she stopped saying it like an apology. "Small progress. I'll take it." Dad kept his word. Sunday dinners became our thing. He asked about my cases. He didn't always understand the legal details, but he listened in a way he never had before. Leaning forward, asking follow-up questions, sometimes shaking his head in disbelief at the injustices I described. One evening, after I told him about a case where a disabled veteran had been wrongfully evicted 2 days before Christmas, he set down his fork and said, "How do you do this every day? How do you carry this?" "Because someone has to," I said. He nodded slowly. I wish I'd understood that sooner. Caroline and I started talking more. Not about everything, we were still learning each other's language, but about enough. She invited me to Tyler's corporate gala, introduced me to his colleagues, and when someone asked what I did, she said, "My sister is an attorney. She fights for veterans. She's incredible at it." I almost fell off my chair. Judge Hargrove and I stayed in touch. Coffee every few weeks, sometimes lunch. She became a mentor in ways I hadn't known I needed. Not about law, but about navigating a world that often overlooked the people doing the hardest work. She never overstepped, never pitied me, never treated me like a project. She treated me like a colleague, and that meant more than she probably knew. One afternoon, months later, she asked me how things were with my family. I told her. The Sunday dinners, Caroline's small but real efforts, my mother's glacial progress. She listened, then said, "You know, I didn't give that speech for your family. I gave it for you. Families can change or they can't, but you needed to hear, in front of everyone, that your work matters, that you matter, because I suspect you'd stopped believing it." She was right. I had stopped believing it. Not about my work, I knew my work mattered, but about me, the person behind the briefs and the arguments, the woman who drove 5 hours to sit in a hallway and told herself that was fine. That person had stopped believing she deserved better. Judge Hargrove didn't save my family. She saved something more important. She saved my understanding of my own worth. She reminded me that the same fire I brought to courtrooms, the refusal to accept injustice, the insistence that every person deserves dignity, applied to me too. I had spent years fighting for strangers and accepting crumbs from the people closest to me. That hallway was just the latest in a long line of folding chairs I'd quietly accepted. No more. Last Thanksgiving, I hosted dinner at my apartment for the first time. Small place, nothing fancy. A 2-bedroom in Charlotte with mismatched chairs and a table I'd bought at a second-hand store. My parents came. Caroline and Tyler came. Judge Hargrove came, because by then she was family in every way that mattered. We sat around that second-hand table, passing dishes, telling stories, laughing at things that weren't even that funny, but felt good to laugh at. My father raised his glass and said simply, "To Rachel, thank you for not giving up on us." I looked around that table, at the people who were finally learning to see me, at the judge who had refused to let me be invisible, at the mismatched chairs that somehow all fit, and I thought about that hallway in Savannah. The folding chair, the coat rack, the bread roll, and I realized something. The chair was never the problem. The problem was that I had accepted it. I had sat down, smoothed my dress, and convinced myself that discomfort was the same as belonging. It wasn't. It never was. If you're hearing this, maybe you've had your own hallway. Maybe there's a folding chair somewhere in your life that you've been sitting in for too long, telling yourself it's fine, telling yourself you don't need more. Maybe your family doesn't see you. Maybe the people who should celebrate you the loudest are the ones who stay the quietest. Here's what I learned. You don't have to wait for a judge to walk into your hallway. You can stand up on your own. But if someone does show up, if someone sees you when no one else bothers to look, let them. Let them pull you into the room. Let them say the things you've been too tired to say for yourself. You deserve a seat at the table, not in the overflow, not beside the coat rack, at the table. And if they won't give you one, bring your own chair. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you'd like more stories about courage, resilience, and the moments that change everything, tap subscribe. I'll be here.